Sometimes the greatest act of love is keeping someone hidden from the world. For 20 years, Cordelia has protected her stepdaughter Mira, knowing that some secrets are worth a lifetime of lies. In the mountain village of Ravenshollow, the mating ceremony happens once every decade. The alpha vampire chooses his bride from the village maidens, but Mira has never been presented. Hidden in the root cellars beneath their cottage, she carries the bloodline of a banished queen. Cordelia knows that if Lord Damon discovers Mira's true heritage, everything will change. For a century, the alpha has slumbered peacefully. But when Mira accidentally cuts her hand while gathering herbs, one drop of blood changes everything. The scent awakens something ancient and hungry. Will Mira's hidden bloodline bring salvation or doom to them all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mist never truly lifted from Ravenshollow. It clung to the ancient stone cottages, like the memories of those who had lived and died within these mountain walls for centuries. Cordelia Thorne stood at her kitchen window, watching the grey tendrils curl around the village square, where preparations for the mating ceremony had begun in earnest. Her weathered hands trembled slightly as she gripped the windowsill, not from age, though 63 years had left their mark, but from the weight of the secret she had carried for 20 years. Below in the root cellars, Mira was likely tending to the herb garden Cordelia had cultivated in the underground chambers. The girl knew nothing of ceremonies or vampires, or the blood that ran through her veins like liquid starlight. She knew only the safety of stone walls and the love of the woman who had raised her as her own. Cordelia's gaze drifted to the Bloodline Chronicle, hidden beneath loose floorboards near the scented hearth. The leather-bound tome contained genealogies that could topple kingdoms and start wars. Within its pages, the lineage of Queen Lirelei was meticulously documented, every marriage, every birth, every death that had led to the single most important life in Ravenshollow, Mira's life. The village had been founded 3 centuries ago when the first vampire lord, seeking respite from the endless wars of the lowlands, had made a covenant with human settlers. Protection in exchange for tribute, peace in exchange for periodic sacrifice. The mating ceremony was the culmination of that ancient pact, a ritual that bound vampire and human in ways that transcended mere political alliance. Every decade, the alpha vampire would awaken from his regenerative slumber to choose a bride from among the village's eligible maidens. The chosen one would live in the castle, bearing children who would bridge the gap between mortal and immortal, ensuring the continuation of the covenant. It was, the village elders insisted, an honor beyond measure. Cordelia had seen 3 ceremonies in her lifetime. She remembered the first, when she was barely older than Mira, was now the way the entire village had held its collective breath. As Lord Damon emerged from his castle, tall and pale and beautiful in a way that made mortals forget how dangerous he truly was. The second ceremony had taken place during her young adulthood, when she had been among the presented maidens herself. She remembered the relief when his dark eyes had passed over her without interest. The third ceremony had been different. 21 years ago, Damon had chosen a girl named Elena Blackwood, daughter of a merchant family from the next valley over. Elena had been radiant with joy at her selection, convinced she was embarking on a fairy tale romance. The entire village had celebrated for days. 6 months later, Elena was dead. The official story was illness, a fever that had taken her suddenly. Only Cordelia knew the truth. Elena had been pregnant with a child whose bloodline would have challenged the very foundations of vampire rule. A child who carried not just vampire heritage, but the sleeping power of the old royal houses. Lord Damon, in his pragmatic way, had ensured that such a complication would never come to pass. But Elena's child had not died with her. In her final moments, Elena had begged Cordelia to save the baby, to take her far from the village and raise her in safety. Cordelia, who had been the girl's closest friend, had agreed. She had staged the child's death, claiming the fever had taken both mother and daughter. In reality, she had spirited the baby away to the abandoned cottage on the village's edge, where protective ward stones had been placed by Elena's grandmother decades earlier. For 20 years, those ward stones had kept Mira hidden from supernatural detection. Cordelia had reinforced them regularly, strengthening their power with her own modest magical abilities. She had told the village that Mira was her late sister's child, orphaned by plague and too sickly to venture far from home. The story had been accepted without question, after all. Who would suspect that the most powerful bloodline in the known world was living quietly beneath a root cellar, tending herbs and reading books by candlelight? The cottage door creaked open, and Mira emerged from the cellar entrance, her arms full of freshly harvested vervain and wolfsbane. At 20, she had grown into a beauty that made Cordelia's heart ache with worry. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, shot through with copper that caught the light even in the perpetual mist. Her eyes were the deep green of forest pools, flecked with gold that seemed to shimmer within a fire. She moved with an unconscious grace that spoke of royal breeding, though she had no idea such blood flowed through her veins. "The wolfsbane is particularly potent this season," Mira said, setting her harvest. On the kitchen table, "I could smell its strength from 3 rows away." Cordelia nodded, trying to keep her expression neutral. Mira's enhanced senses had been manifesting gradually over the past year, along with other subtle changes that made Cordelia's protective instincts scream warnings. The girl was coming into her power, and soon no amount of ward stones would be able to contain the supernatural signature of her bloodline. "We'll dry it properly and store it with the others," Cordelia replied. "Winter is coming early this year, and we'll need every herb we can preserve." Mira settled into the chair across from her, unconsciously elegant, even in her simple brown dress and work apron. "Cordelia, may I ask you something?" The question came with a tone that made Cordelia's pulse quicken. "Of course, dear one. Why have I never attended the village festivals, or the harvest celebrations? I see the other young women my age when they pass by on the road, and they look so happy, so free. They speak of dances and courtship and—" She paused, her cheeks coloring slightly. "And the upcoming ceremony. Everyone seems so excited about Lord Damon's awakening." Cordelia's heart clenched. This conversation had been inevitable, and she had prepared for it countless times. But no amount of preparation could make the lies come easier. "You know, your constitution has always been delicate, Mira. The excitement and crowds could overwhelm you. But I feel perfectly strong," Mira protested gently. "Stronger than I've ever felt, actually. Sometimes I think I could run from here to the village square without losing my breath. Sometimes I feel like—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "Never mind. It sounds foolish. Nothing you say is foolish to me," Cordelia said, though part of her dreaded what might come next. "Sometimes I feel like there's something inside me waiting to wake up, like I'm only half myself, and the other half is sleeping." Mira's eyes grew, distant. "In my dreams, I see places I've never been. A great castle with towers that reach into the clouds, a woman with hair like mine, wearing a crown of silver thorns. She's always trying to tell me something, but I wake before I can understand her words." The dreams were starting. Cordelia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Queen Lirelei had been reaching out to her descendant, trying to awaken the power that was Mira's birthright. Soon, dreams would not be enough to contain what was stirring within the girl. "Dreams are often strange," Cordelia said carefully. "Perhaps you've been reading too many of those old fairy tales." Mira smiled, but there was something knowing in her expression that hadn't been there before. "Perhaps, though fairy tales usually have princes and happy endings. In my dreams, the woman with the crown always looks so sad." Outside, the sound of hammering echoed across the village as workers erected the ceremonial platform where Lord Damon would make his selection. The noise seemed to agitate something in Mira. She turned toward the window with an expression of longing so intense that Cordelia had to look away. "Tell me about the ceremony," Mira said quietly. "Please, I've only heard fragments from the village children, and they're probably exaggerated." Cordelia sighed. Perhaps some truth, carefully edited, would be safer than allowing Mira's imagination to run wild. Every 10 years, Lord Damon emerges from his castle to choose a bride from among the eligible young women of the village. It's an ancient tradition, part of the covenant that keeps our village safe and prosperous. And the chosen girl, what happens to her? She goes to live in the castle as his consort. She's honored above all others, given every luxury imaginable. Cordelia kept her voice steady, not mentioning that few of those honored consorts lived to see their 30th birthday. Do they love each other, the Lord and his chosen? The question was asked with such wistful innocence that Cordelia felt her heart break a little. Love is complicated between mortals and immortals, dear one. What they share is more like destiny, a bond that goes deeper than ordinary human affection. Mira was quiet for a long moment, absently braiding and unbraiding a strand of her copper hair. "I dream about him sometimes too," she admitted. "A man with dark eyes and pale skin. He's searching for something he's lost, and he's so terribly lonely. When I wake up, I feel like crying, though I don't know why." Cordelia's blood went cold. The soul bond was manifesting even through the ward stones. Despite 20 years of protection, despite every precaution she had taken, Mira was beginning to connect with her destined mate, which meant time was running out faster than she had anticipated. "Mira," she said, choosing her words with infinite care, "I need you to promise me something. No matter how curious you become about the village or the ceremony, you must not leave this property until after the full moon passes. Can you do that for me?" "Of course, but why?" "Promise me," Cordelia insisted, her voice sharper than intended. "This is important, more important than you know." Mira's eyes widened at her stepmother's intensity, but she nodded slowly. "I promise, though I wish you would tell me what has you so frightened." If only she could. If only Cordelia could explain that in 3 days, Lord Damon would awaken, expecting to find his destined mate among the village maidens. If only she could describe the supernatural storm that would follow when he detected no trace of the bloodline that called to his very soul. If only she could make Mira understand that her safety depended on remaining hidden until Damon made his selection and returned to his slumber, disappointed but resigned to wait another decade. Instead, Cordelia rose from her chair and gathered the herbs Mira had collected. "Help me prepare these for drying," she said. "And tonight I'll tell you some of the old stories. Would you like that?" Mira's face brightened. "The ones about Queen Lirelei?" "Yes," Cordelia said softly, her heart heavy with the weight of truths she could not yet speak. "Those are the ones." As they worked together in the fading afternoon light, neither woman noticed the figure watching from the tree line beyond the cottage. Magnus Ironhold, the village elder, had been observing the isolated property for weeks, growing increasingly suspicious about the ward stones and the young woman who never ventured into the village proper. The mating ceremony was too important to allow for any irregularities. If there was an eligible maiden being hidden from Lord Damon's consideration, Magnus intended to discover why. The vampire lord's happiness, and by extension, the village's continued prosperity, depended on his satisfaction with the selection presented to him. Magnus made note of the girl's appearance, her unusual grace, and the way the very air seemed to shimmer around her as she moved. Tomorrow, he would begin asking more pointed questions about Cordelia Thorne's supposed niece. The ceremony was only 3 days away, and every eligible maiden must be accounted for. As darkness settled over Ravenshallow, Cordelia felt the first stirrings of unease that had nothing to do with her conversation with Mira. The protective wards around the cottage flickered almost imperceptibly, as if something ancient and powerful had brushed against them from a great distance. In his castle, high above the village, something stirred in the darkness. The waiting was almost over. The morning brought an unusual clarity to the mountain air, as if the perpetual mist had retreated in anticipation of something momentous. Mira woke with a strange restlessness thrumming through her veins, a sensation like lightning trapped beneath her skin. Her dreams had been more vivid than ever. The dark-eyed man searching through empty halls, calling out for someone whose face he could never quite remember. She dressed quickly in her work clothes and made her way to the herb garden in the root cellar. The underground chamber had always been her sanctuary, lit by oil lamps and filled with the earthy scents of growing things. But today, even the familiar comfort of the space felt confining. The walls seemed to press closer, and the air felt thick with anticipation. Cordelia had risen early and gone to the village for market day, leaving Mira alone with strict instructions to remain inside until her return. But the restlessness was becoming unbearable. Mira found herself pacing the narrow corridors between the herb beds, her hands tingling with an energy she couldn't name. She was reaching for a bundle of sage when it happened. The old wooden shelf, weakened by years of dampness, gave way beneath her touch. As it crashed to the ground, one of the glass jars shattered, and a shard caught her palm, slicing deep across the lifeline that ran from her wrist to her fingers. Blood welled immediately, darker than it should have been, with an almost luminescent quality that made her breath catch. She stared at the wound, transfixed by the way the blood seemed to pulse with its own inner light. 3 drops fell to the earthen floor before she thought to press a cloth against the cut. The moment her blood touched the soil, everything changed. The wardstones embedded in the cottage walls, invisible guardians that had protected her for 20 years, began to crack. Not visibly, their physical forms remained intact, but their magical essence fractured like ice in the spring thaw. The protective barrier that had hidden Mira's supernatural signature dissolved in an instant, sending ripples of ancient power cascading across the mountainside. 5 miles away, in the depths of his castle's most secure chamber, Lord Damon Blackthorne felt the change like a thunderclap in his soul. The Lord's Awakening Chalice, a silver goblet that had remained clear as crystal for a century, suddenly filled with blood-red light. The chalice had been created to detect the blood of his destined mate, and now it blazed with an intensity that made the very air around it shimmer. Damon's eyes opened for the first time in 10 years. They were the color of winter storms, pale grey shot through with silver, and they fixed immediately on the chalice with a hunger that had nothing to do with bloodlust. For a century he had waited. Through 3 failed ceremonies, through decades of disappointed slumber, he had held onto the prophecy that promised him a mate whose blood would call to his very essence. Now she was here. Somewhere in his domain, the woman who would complete him had awakened to her power. Her scent reached him even through the castle's stone walls, wild roses and mountain storms, with an underlying sweetness that made his centuries-old heart race with anticipation. He rose from the ornate bed where he had lain dormant, his tall frame moving with predatory grace despite the long sleep. His pale skin seemed to glow in the chamber's candlelight, and his dark hair fell in waves to his shoulders, framing features that were beautiful in the way of carved marble, perfect but cold. But there was nothing cold about the way he breathed in deeply, trying to capture more of that intoxicating scent. She was close, very close, and she was magnificent. Back at the cottage, Mira stumbled backward as a wave of sensation crashed over her. It felt like standing too close to a bonfire, not painful, but overwhelming in its intensity. Images flashed through her mind, ancient stone corridors, a man with storm-grey eyes calling her name, hands that she somehow knew would be gentle despite their obvious strength. She pressed her back against the cellar wall, struggling to understand what was happening to her. The cut on her palm was healing with impossible speed, leaving only a thin silver line that gleamed like moonlight against her skin. But the healing brought no relief from the strange energy coursing through her body. "What's happening to me?" she whispered to the empty chamber. As if in answer, the temperature in the cellar dropped 20 degrees. Frost began to form on the herb leaves, and her breath came out in visible puffs. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of wings, not the gentle flutter of birds, but the powerful beat of something much larger and infinitely more dangerous. In the castle, Damon was already moving. He had not bothered with ceremonial robes or the formal preparations that usually preceded his emergence. The scent of his mate's blood was like a beacon calling him home, and nothing would delay his response to that call. He strode through corridors that had not seen their master's presence in years, past tapestries depicting the history of vampire rule and portraits of previous lords of the domain. The castle's other inhabitants, servants, who had tended the halls during his slumber, scattered before him like leaves in a hurricane. They had never seen their lord with such focused intensity, such barely controlled power radiating from every step he took. As he reached the castle's main hall, Damon paused only long enough to retrieve the soul bond compass from its place of honor above the massive fireplace. The ancient device, crafted by the first vampire lords to help them find their destined mates, had pointed steadily north for 3 centuries. Now the needle spun wildly before settling on a direction that made Damon's lips curve in the first genuine smile he had worn in decades. Southeast, toward the village proper, but not quite within its borders. Somewhere on the outskirts, hidden away like a treasure waiting to be discovered. He was airborne within minutes, his powerful wings carrying him through the crisp mountain air with speed that blurred the landscape below. The trail grew stronger with every mile, leading him toward a section of the village he rarely visited during his ceremonial emergencies. The area where the poorest residents lived in cottages that bordered on the wild lands beyond human habitation. Meanwhile, Cordelia was making her way through the village market when the supernatural disturbance hit her like a physical blow. Every magical practitioner in Ravenshollow felt it, a shift in the very fabric of reality that spoke of ancient powers awakening. But for Cordelia, who knew exactly what that shift meant, the sensation brought terror so complete that she dropped her basket of purchases and ran. She raced through the winding mountain paths toward her cottage, her aging legs carrying her faster than they had moved in decades. The protective wards were broken. After 20 years of perfect concealment, Mira's bloodline had been exposed. And if Cordelia could feel the magical disruption from miles away, then Lord Damon certainly could as well. She was still half a mile from home when she saw him. Lord Damon circled the cottage like a bird of prey, his massive form casting shadows that seemed to move independently of his flight. Even from a distance, Cordelia could see the way he held himself, not with the detached curiosity he usually displayed during ceremonies, but with the focused intensity of a predator who had found his quarry. He landed in the cottage's front garden with enough force to crack the stone pathway. For a moment, he simply stood there, breathing deeply and letting the scent of his mate wash over him. Then he began to walk toward the cottage door with purposeful strides. In the root cellar, Mira felt his approach like an earthquake in her soul. Her body was responding to his presence in ways she didn't understand, her pulse racing, her skin tingling with anticipation, her very bones seeming to sing with recognition. Part of her wanted to run, to hide deeper in the underground chambers, until this overwhelming sensation passed. But a larger part, a part that felt ancient and wise and utterly certain, wanted nothing more than to throw open the cottage door and finally meet the man who had haunted her dreams. When Damon reached the cottage entrance, he found the door warded with protections more powerful than any he had encountered in centuries. The magic was old, skillfully woven, and absolutely determined to keep him out. He could break through. Of course, his power far exceeded that of any human practitioner. But doing so would likely harm the woman inside, and every instinct he possessed screamed against, causing her any distress. Instead, he placed his hand against the wooden door and spoke in a voice that carried easily through the cottage walls. "I know you're there," he said, and his tone was gentler than Cordelia would have expected from the village's immortal lord. "I can feel your heartbeat, hear your breath. You have nothing to fear from me. I've been waiting for you for a very long time." In the cellar, Mira's hand rose unconsciously to her throat, as if she could somehow contain the racing of her pulse. The voice was exactly as she had imagined it in her dreams, deep and melodious, with an accent that spoke of centuries and distant places. But there was something else in his words, a loneliness so profound that it made her chest ache with sympathy. Before she could stop herself, she called out in response, "Who are you?" The silence that followed was so complete that even the mountain wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, soft as a whisper but carrying clearly through the cottage, "Your mate." The word hung in the air between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Mira pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the cellar, her mind reeling with the impossibility of what she had just heard. Mate. The concept was foreign to her sheltered existence, yet something deep within her soul recognized the truth of it. With terrifying clarity, above her she could hear his footsteps as he moved around the cottage's perimeter, testing the magical barriers that kept him from entering. Each step sent vibrations through the floorboards, and she found herself tracking his movement with an awareness that seemed to bypass her conscious mind entirely. Her body knew where he was at every moment, as if they were connected by invisible threads. "What's your name?" His voice came from directly above the cellar entrance now, and she could hear the careful patience in his tone. "Mira," she whispered, then cleared her throat and spoke louder. "Mira Thorne." A pause. When he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "Thorne, you're Cordelia's ward." The way he said Cordelia's name made Mira's protective instincts flare. "She's my stepmother. She's cared for me my entire life." "Has she indeed?" There was no warmth in those words. "And has she told you what you are, Mira Thorne? Has she explained why your blood sings to mine across the very air?" Mira's hand went instinctively to her palm, where the cut had healed with that strange silver scar. "I don't understand any of this. Until today, I didn't even know that vampires were real." The silence that followed was so profound, she wondered if he had left. Then she heard him settle onto the ground outside the cottage, as if preparing to wait however long it took for her to emerge. "Your stepmother has much to answer for," he said finally, "but we have time for that conversation later. Right now, I need you to understand that you are in no danger from me. The bond between us, it cannot be forced or faked. You feel it too, don't you? The recognition?" Mira closed her eyes, trying to deny what her entire being knew to be true. She did feel it, a connection that went beyond physical attraction or romantic interest. It was as if a part of her soul that she hadn't known was missing had suddenly snapped into place. The loneliness that had plagued her dreams, the sense of searching for something she couldn't name, all of it made terrible sense now. "I feel it," she admitted quietly. "But I don't understand what it means." "It means we belong to each other," Damon said, and his voice carried a reverence that made her chest tighten. "It means that after a century of searching, I've finally found the other half of my soul." While this extraordinary conversation unfolded, Cordelia was racing through the forest paths that led to her cottage. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she caught sight of the massive winged figure settled in her garden like a dark angel of judgment. Lord Damon had found Mira, and the careful life she had built to protect her stepdaughter was crumbling around them. But as she drew closer, Cordelia realized something that stopped her in her tracks. The cottage was still standing, the protective wards, though cracked, were still holding. And Damon, despite his obvious power, was sitting outside like a supplicant, rather than breaking down the barriers that separated him from his mate. Hidden in the shadows of the tree line, she could hear their voices carrying on the mountain air. The vampire lord's tone was patient, almost tender, nothing like the cold authority she had witnessed during previous ceremonies. And Mira, sweet, innocent Mira, was speaking to him with a courage that made Cordelia's heart swell with pride and terror in equal measure. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her eavesdropping. Magnus Ironhold and 3 other village elders were riding hard toward the cottage, their faces grim with purpose. They had felt the magical disturbance as well, and they were coming to investigate. Cordelia stepped out of the forest before they could ride past her position. "Magnus, what brings you to my home?" The village elder reined in his mount, his weathered face creased with suspicion. "You know exactly why we're here, Cordelia. The magical disruption, it came from this direction, and Lord Damon himself has awakened early from his slumber." His eyes narrowed as he took in her disheveled appearance. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" "I know nothing more than you do," Cordelia replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. It wasn't entirely a lie. She had no idea how Mira's blood had been spilled or why the Wardstones had chosen this moment to fail. Magnus dismounted and handed his reins to one of the other men. "Then you won't mind if we investigate the source of the disturbance? Our Lord's happiness is paramount to the village's well-being." "Of course," Cordelia said, though every instinct screamed at her to prevent these men from reaching her cottage. "Though I should warn you, Lord Damon is already here." That gave Magnus pause. In all the years he had served as village elder, he had never known the vampire lord to investigate magical disturbances personally. Such matters were typically handled by his mortal servants. "He's here. Why?" Cordelia gestured toward the cottage, where Damon's massive form was clearly visible in the garden. "Perhaps you should ask him yourself." Back at the cottage, Mira had worked up the courage to move closer to the cellar entrance. She could hear the conversation between Cordelia and the village elders, and she realized with growing alarm that their private moment was about to become very public. "There are others coming," she told Damon urgently. "Village officials. If they find me here, they will find you exactly where you belong," Damon interrupted, his voice taking on an edge of steel. "You are my mate, Mira. No one, not the village elders, not your stepmother, not anyone, has the right to keep you from me." The possessiveness in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, it sent a thrill of something dangerously close to excitement through her veins. For 20 years, she had been hidden, protected, kept safe from a world she was deemed too fragile to navigate. But this man, this powerful, ancient being, spoke to her as if she were his equal, as if she were someone worth claiming. "I've never been claimed by anyone," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "And I have never had anything worth claiming," he replied. "Until now." The sound of approaching footsteps made them both fall silent. Cordelia arrived first, her face pale with worry as she took in the sight of Lord Damon, sitting calmly in her garden. Behind her, Magnus and his companions looked as if they had stumbled into a situation far beyond their understanding. "My lord," Magnus said, dropping into a formal bow, "we felt the magical disturbance and came to investigate. We had no idea you had already responded to the awakening of my mate," Damon finished, rising to his full imposing height. "Yes, Magnus, after a century of waiting, she has finally come into her power." The village elder's eyes widened as he looked around the modest cottage garden. "Your mate is here? But my lord, the ceremony isn't for 3 days. The eligible maidens haven't been presented. The eligible maidens are irrelevant," Damon said with quiet finality. "My mate has been chosen not by ceremony but by destiny. She is here, in this cottage, and she will come with me when she is ready." Cordelia stepped forward, her protective instincts overriding her fear. "My lord, Mira is young and innocent. She knows nothing of vampire customs or the responsibilities that come with such a bond. Perhaps if you would allow her time she should have been given years ago," Damon interrupted, his storm-grey eyes fixing on Cordelia with laser intensity. "Time to learn about her heritage, time to understand what she is. Time to prepare for the destiny you have kept hidden from her." The accusation in his voice was unmistakable, and Cordelia felt the weight of 20 years of secrets pressing down on her shoulders. Around her, she could sense the village elders' growing confusion and alarm. This was not how mating ceremonies were supposed to proceed. There were protocols, traditions, safeguards that had been in place for centuries. From the cellar below, Mira listened to the conversation with growing understanding. Destiny, heritage, the words her stepmother had always deflected were being spoken aloud by this man who claimed to be her mate. And for the first time in her life, she was hearing someone argue that she deserved to know the truth. The tension in the cottage garden could have been cut with a blade. Magnus and his fellow elders exchanged uncertain glances, clearly out of their depth in a situation that had deviated so dramatically from centuries of established protocol. Lord Damon's declaration that he had found his mate should have been cause for celebration. Yet there was an undercurrent of danger in the air that made everyone present acutely aware. They were walking on unstable ground. "My lord," Magnus began carefully, "perhaps we might discuss this matter with more privacy. The young woman should be properly prepared for such momentous news. There are traditions to observe, ceremonies to conduct. The only tradition that matters has already been fulfilled." Damon interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "The soul bond has awakened. Everything else is merely ceremony." Cordelia felt her control slipping as the conversation spiraled beyond her ability to manage. 20 years of careful planning, of strategic isolation, of protective lies, all of it was unraveling in the span of a single afternoon. But worse than her own predicament was the knowledge that Mira was listening to every word, learning truths that Cordelia had hoped to reveal gently, gradually, when the girl was older and better prepared. In the root cellar below, Mira pressed her ear to the floorboards, straining to catch every nuance of the discussion above. The word heritage echoed in her mind, along with Damon's accusation that important truths had been kept from her. She thought of her mother's locket, hidden away in her dresser drawer, the silver pendant that Cordelia claimed had belonged to her late sister. She had always wondered why touching it made her skin tingle with warmth, why the woman in the tiny portrait seemed to watch her with such knowing eyes. Her powers, dormant for so long, were stirring in response to her emotional turmoil. The herb plants around her began to glow with a soft, ethereal light that had nothing to do with the oil lamps. The air itself seemed to shimmer with potential energy, and she could feel something ancient and powerful awakening within her bloodstream. Above ground, Damon suddenly went very still. His nostrils flared as he caught the scent of magic manifesting below, and his eyes took on a predatory gleam that made Magnus take an involuntary step backward. "She's coming into her power," Damon observed, and there was profound satisfaction in his voice. "Even now, without training or guidance, she responds to the bond between us. Remarkable." "Power?" Magnus echoed, his weathered face creasing with confusion. "My lord, forgive my ignorance, but what power could a village girl possibly?" He stopped mid-sentence as the cottage began to glow. It was subtle at first, just a brightening of the shadows around the windows and doorframe, but the light grew stronger, pulsing in rhythm with something that might have been a heartbeat. The very air around the building shimmered with energy that made every hair on Magnus's arms stand on end. "Sweet, merciful ancestors," breathed one of the other elders. "What is she?" Cordelia closed her eyes, feeling the last of her carefully constructed defenses crumble. There was no hiding Mira's nature now, not when her power was manifesting so dramatically. The village elders would demand answers, and Lord Damon, he already knew far more than he was letting on. "Tell them," came a voice from the cottage doorway. Everyone turned to see Mira emerging from the cellar entrance, and the collective intake of breath was audible. The young woman who stepped into the garden was barely recognizable as the shy, hidden girl she had been that morning. Her copper hair seemed to move with its own wind, floating around her shoulders like liquid flame. Her green eyes blazed with inner fire, and her skin had taken on a luminescence that made her appear almost otherworldly. But it was the way she carried herself that truly shocked those present. Gone was the uncertain posture of someone who had spent her life in hiding. In its place stood a woman who moved with unconscious regality, as if ancient royalty flowed through her veins. Which, Cordelia realized with a heavy heart it did. Mira's gaze found Damon first, and the moment their eyes met, the air between them crackled with visible energy. He straightened to his full, impressive height, every line of his body speaking to recognition and reverence. She was beautiful before, but in full possession of her awakening power, she was breathtaking. "You're even more magnificent than I imagined," he said, his voice carrying a note of wonder. Mira felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "And you're exactly as I dreamed you would be." The admission hung between them, laden with implications that made Magnus clear his throat uncomfortably. "My lord, perhaps we might—" "Tell them, Cordelia," Mira repeated, her voice carrying new strength. "Tell them who I really am. I'm tired of hiding from a truth I don't even understand." Cordelia looked at her stepdaughter, this young woman who had been her greatest joy and deepest terror for 20 years, and felt her heart break with pride and fear in equal measure. Mira deserved the truth. She had always deserved it. But truth came with consequences that could destroy everything Cordelia had worked to protect. "Very well," she said quietly, reaching into her apron pocket. Her fingers closed around the small silver locket she had carried every day for 2 decades, the one piece of evidence she had never been able to bring herself to destroy. "But perhaps we should discuss this inside. What I have to tell you, all of you, will change everything." Damon's eyes fixed on the locket with laser intensity. Even at a distance, he could sense the power contained within that small piece of jewelry. Ancient power, royal power. The kind of bloodline magic that hadn't been seen in the known world for over a century. "The locket," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "May I see it?" Cordelia hesitated, then stepped forward and placed the pendant in his outstretched hand. The moment his skin made contact with the silver, the locket sprang open, revealing the miniature portrait within. The face that looked back at them was unmistakably related to Mira, the same copper hair, the same green eyes, the same aristocratic bone structure that spoke of generations of noble breeding. But it was the tiny crown painted above the woman's head that made Magnus stumble backward with shock. "Queen Lirelei," he breathed. "But that's impossible. She died over 20 years ago." "The entire royal line was destroyed," Cordelia finished. "Yes, that's what everyone believed. What everyone needed to believe." She looked at Mira with eyes full of sorrow and love. "But Elena Blackwood didn't die in childbirth, as the official records state. She lived long enough to birth her daughter and beg me to keep her safe from those who would use her power for their own ends." "Elena Blackwood was Queen Lirelei?" Magnus's voice rose to nearly a squeak. "The girl Lord Damon chose 21 years ago was the lost queen." "The exiled queen," Cordelia corrected. "Stripped of her throne and forced to hide among common folk. But royal blood doesn't diminish simply because the crown is lost. It only waits for the right moment to reclaim its heritage." Damon's grip on the locket tightened as the full implications of Cordelia's revelation struck him. Mira wasn't just his destined mate, she was the rightful heir to a kingdom that had been thought lost forever. Her power didn't just complement his, it had the potential to reshape the entire supernatural world. "You're telling us," he said slowly, "that my mate is Queen Lirelei's daughter, the last of the royal bloodline." "I'm telling you," Cordelia replied, "that Mira is far more than any of us realized, and that keeping her hidden may have been the only thing that preserved her life." Mira stood in the center of the garden, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a mantle she had never asked to wear. Everything she had known about herself, about her place in the world, had just been revealed, as carefully constructed lies meant to protect her from a heritage too dangerous to acknowledge. But as overwhelming as the revelations were, one truth stood clear above all others. The man before her, this ancient vampire lord who claimed to be her mate, was looking at her not with hunger for her power, but with something far more precious. He was looking at her as if she were exactly what he had been searching for his entire immortal existence. The silence that followed Cordelia's revelation stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Magnus and his fellow elders stood frozen in shock, their minds struggling to process the magnitude of what they had just learned. The last heir of the royal bloodline, a lineage they had been taught was extinct, had been living quietly in their village for 20 years. Damon broke the silence first, his voice carefully controlled, despite the storm of emotions raging beneath his composed exterior. "Show me the soul bond compass." He reached into his coat and withdrew the ancient device, its ornate bronze surface, gleaming in the strange light that still emanated from Mira's presence. The compass, which had spun wildly during his flight to the cottage, now pointed steadily toward her with unwavering precision. But more than that, the needle glowed with the same ethereal light that surrounded her, confirming what they all now understood. "The bond is absolute," Damon said, his eyes never leaving Mira's face. "She is not just my destined mate, she is the completion of a prophecy that has guided vampire rule for over 3 centuries. Magnus found his voice first among the elders, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What prophecy, my lord?" "The covenant of blood and crown," Damon replied, still watching Mira with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "It was foretold that when the lost royal line returned, it would unite with the vampire lords to create a new age of peace between our peoples. But the prophecy also warned of great danger, that there would be those who would seek to prevent such a union or to corrupt it for their own purposes." Cordelia stepped protectively closer to Mira, her maternal instincts overriding her fear of the vampire lord. "Which is exactly why I kept her hidden. The political implications of her existence, the power struggles it would unleash, are no longer your decision to make," Damon interrupted, though his tone was not unkind. "She has awakened to her heritage. The choice now belongs to her." All eyes turned to Mira, who stood in the center of their attention, feeling as if the very ground beneath her feet had shifted. 20 years of believing herself to be nothing more than a sickly ward had been stripped away in minutes, replaced by a destiny so vast it made her dizzy to contemplate. "I need to understand," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "If my mother was Queen Lirelei, what happened to her kingdom? Why was she in hiding?" It was Magnus who answered, his historian's memory providing details that Cordelia had hoped never to revisit. The royal kingdom fell to internal strife 25 years ago. Queen Lirelei was betrayed by her own council, accused of practicing forbidden magic and consorting with dark powers. She escaped the palace before they could execute her, but her entire family was murdered. "We believed she had died in exile." "She did," Cordelia said quietly, "but not before giving birth to the next generation of the royal line. Elena Lirelei lived just long enough to see her daughter safely into my care." Mira absorbed this information with growing understanding. "The dreams I've been having, the woman with the crown who looked so sad, that was my mother, wasn't it? She's been trying to reach me. The royal bloodline carries the memories of its ancestors," Damon explained. "As your power grows stronger, you'll likely experience more visions from those who came before. It's both a gift and a burden of your heritage." The implications of Mira's lineage were staggering. If she truly was the rightful heir to the Lost Kingdom, her union with Damon would create a political alliance more powerful than anything the supernatural world had seen in centuries. But it would also make her a target for every ambitious faction that sought to control or destroy such power. As if summoned by that very thought, a new presence made itself known. The temperature in the garden dropped precipitously, and frost began to form on the plants despite the afternoon warmth. Everyone present felt it, a malevolent force approaching from the direction of the village. Damon's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. Gone was the patient suitor, replaced by the apex predator that had ruled these lands for centuries. His eyes went silver-white with power, and his canine teeth elongated into fangs that caught the light with deadly promise. "Get behind me," he commanded Mira, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "All of you move away from the Riznat cottage." But Mira found herself moving toward him instead of away, drawn by an instinct she didn't fully understand. When her hand touched his arm, the contact sent a surge of energy through both of them that made the air around them shimmer with visible power. "What is it?" she asked, surprised by her own calm in the face of obvious danger. "Enemies," Damon replied grimly. "Those who would seek to prevent our union or use you for their own purposes. They've sensed your awakening." Through the trees surrounding the cottage, dark shapes began to emerge. They moved with inhuman grace and speed, and even at a distance, their supernatural nature was unmistakable. These were not ordinary threats. They were beings of considerable power who had come prepared for conflict. Magnus and his fellow elders cowered behind the cottage's stone walls, clearly out of their depth in what was rapidly becoming a supernatural battle. But Cordelia surprised everyone by producing an ornate dagger from beneath her skirts, the Queensbane dagger, its blade gleaming with runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "This belonged to the assassin who tried to kill Lirelei," she said, her voice grim with determination. "I've carried it for 20 years, waiting for the day her enemies would come for her daughter." Damon's eyes widened as he recognized the weapon. That blade has tasted royal blood. "In the right hands, it could kill anyone who threatens the royal line," Cordelia finished. "Even vampires, if necessity demands it." The advancing enemies paused at the edge of the garden, their leader a tall figure shrouded in darkness, calling out in a voice that carried across the mountain air like winter wind. "Surrender the girl, and we will allow the rest of you to live. She belongs with those who can properly guide her power." Damon's response was immediate and uncompromising. "She belongs with no one but herself, and anyone who seeks to harm her will face the consequences." Mira felt power surge through her veins as her protective instincts awakened fully for the first time. The light emanating from her skin brightened until it was nearly blinding, and the plants in Cordelia's garden began to grow with impossible speed, their vines and thorns weaving together to form natural barriers. "I'm not going anywhere with people who threaten my family," she declared, her voice carrying new authority. "This is my choice to make." The leader of the attacking force laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. "Foolish child, you understand nothing of what you are or what you're capable of, but you will learn whether willingly or through force." As the enemies began to advance again, Damon spread his massive wings and positioned himself between them and Mira. But she stepped up beside him rather than behind him, her power manifesting as vines and thorns that responded to her will with devastating precision. "Together," she said simply, and the "not" word carried the weight of destiny fulfilled. For the first time in a century, Damon smiled with genuine joy. His mate was not a fragile flower to be protected. She was a force of nature in her own right, worthy of standing beside him as an equal. The battle for Mira's destiny was about to begin. The first clash came swiftly and without further warning. The shrouded leader gestured with one pale hand, and 3 of his companions launched themselves forward with inhuman speed, their forms blurring as they crossed the garden in heartbeats. But they had underestimated both the strength of their opponents and the power of a newly awakened royal bloodline. Damon met the first attacker mid-leap, his own supernatural speed, allowing him to intercept the creature before it could reach Mira. The collision sent shockwaves through the air, and both combatants crashed into the stone wall of the cottage with enough force to crack the ancient masonry. But Damon was already moving again, his centuries of combat experience evident in every calculated strike. Meanwhile, Mira discovered that her power responded to more than just emotional distress. As the second attacker approached her, she instinctively raised her hands, and the very earth beneath his feet erupted in a tangle of thorny vines that wrapped around his legs and torso with crushing force. The creature's inhuman shriek of rage and pain pierced the mountain air as he struggled against bonds that only grew stronger with his resistance. The third attacker had targeted Cordelia, perhaps believing the older woman would be the easiest prey. He learned his error when her blade met his claws with a sound like thunder. The Queensbane dagger's runes blazed with golden light as it tasted supernatural blood, and the creature stumbled backward with a wound that refused to heal. "Impressive," called the enemy leader from his position at the garden's edge. "But you face only my scouts. The true test has yet to begin." As if responding to his words, the air around the cottage began to thicken with an oppressive, magical presence. More figures emerged from the forest, dozens of them, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of military training and supernatural enhancement. These were not random threats drawn by Mira's awakening. They were an organized force that had come prepared for exactly this confrontation. Damon dispatched his opponent with ruthless efficiency and moved to Mira's side, his storm-grey eyes assessing the approaching threat with tactical precision. "How many can you handle?" he asked, and there was no condescension in the question, only respect for her proven abilities. "I don't know," Mira admitted, her hands still glowing with the power that had trapped her attacker. "But I'm willing to find out." It was then that Cordelia made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her days. Reaching into her apron, she withdrew a small crystal that pulsed with inner light, memory crystal she had kept hidden for 2 decades. In it were stored the final memories of Queen Lirelei, recorded in her dying moments and preserved for her daughter's eventual awakening. "Mira," Cordelia called urgently, even as she continued to fend off supernatural attackers with her enchanted blade. "Catch this, and whatever you do, don't let it shatter." She threw the crystal in a high arc that carried it over the heads of their enemies. Mira caught it instinctively, and the moment her fingers closed around the smooth surface, the world exploded into visions. She was no longer standing in Cordelia's garden, but in a magnificent throne room, with soaring ceilings and windows that looked out over a kingdom stretching to the horizon. A woman who shared her face and hair sat upon a throne of silver and starlight, but her expression was one of profound sorrow. "My daughter," the vision of Queen Lirelei spoke, and her voice carried across 20 years of separation with perfect clarity. "If you are seeing this, then the time has come for you to claim your birthright. But know that power without wisdom is destruction, and strength without compassion is tyranny." The vision shifted, showing Mira scenes from her mother's life, the betrayal by trusted advisors, the desperate flight from the kingdom, the secret alliance with vampire lords that had been twisted into accusations of dark magic. But it also showed her the true nature of her royal heritage, power over the natural world that could heal or destroy, the ability to command the loyalty of supernatural beings, and most importantly, the responsibility to protect those who could not protect themselves. "The blood of queens flows through your veins," Lirelei continued, "but it is your heart that will determine what kind of ruler you become. Trust in your mate. The bond between vampire and royal blood is ancient and sacred. Together, you can restore what was lost and build something greater than what came." Before, the vision faded just as quickly as it had begun, leaving Mira gasping and disoriented, but filled with newfound understanding. The power she had been unconsciously restraining suddenly flowed through her with perfect control, and she understood for the first time what she was truly capable of. Around her, the attacking creatures had pressed closer during her momentary absence, but now they faltered as they felt the change in her magical signature. This was no longer an untrained girl stumbling through her first manifestation of power. This was a queen awakening to her full potential. Mira raised her hands, and every plant in a quarter-mile radius responded to her call. Trees that had stood for centuries bent their branches to create barriers and weapons. Flowers released clouds of pollen that sent enemies stumbling and choking. The very grass beneath their feet grew into restraining nets that held fast against supernatural strength. But it was when she spoke that the true impact of her transformation became clear. "By right of blood and by power of crown, I command you to cease this attack and withdraw from my lands," she declared, her voice carrying across the mountainside with authority that resonated in the very stones beneath their feet. The effect on the attacking force was immediate and dramatic. Those creatures of lesser power found themselves unable to disobey the direct command of royal blood. They stumbled to a halt, their aggressive postures shifting to confused submission despite their obvious desire to continue the assault. Only the leader and his inner circle remained unaffected, their own considerable power providing some protection against Mira's compulsion. But even they seemed shaken by the display of authority they had just witnessed. "Remarkable," the leader said, and now there was genuine interest in his voice rather than mere condescension. "You truly are Liralei's daughter, but raw power and noble bloodline are not enough to rule, girl. You lack the experience to wield such authority wisely." "Then perhaps," Damon said, moving to stand beside Mira, with wings spread wide and fangs gleaming, "she should have the opportunity to gain that experience without interference from those who would use her for their own ends." The standoff that followed was charged with tension that made the air itself feel heavy. Two supernatural powers of enormous magnitude faced each other across a cottage garden, while the fate of both human and vampire communities hung in the balance. It was Magnus who broke the stalemate, stepping forward with more courage than anyone would have credited the elderly village elder with possessing. "My lord," he addressed the enemy leader directly, "with respect, this matter concerns the welfare of our village and the ancient covenants that govern our relationship with Lord Damon. What authority do you claim here?" The leader's laugh was sharp and cold. "Authority? I claim the authority of necessity, old man." The girl's power, left unchecked and unguided, could destabilize the supernatural balance across 3 kingdoms. She must be properly trained, properly controlled, properly enslaved, Mira interrupted, her newly awakened memories providing context for his carefully chosen words. "That's what happened to my mother, isn't it? Those who claimed to be helping her were actually seeking to control her power for their own purposes." The leader's silence was answer enough. "Then this conversation is over," she said with finality that surprised everyone present, including herself. "I choose my own path, and I choose to walk it beside those who respect my right to make that choice." The enemy leader's response to Mira's declaration was a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "How noble, how foolishly idealistic, just like your aunt." The words hit the garden like a thunderbolt, freezing everyone in place. Mira's newly awakened confidence wavered as the implication of what he had just said settled over her like ice water. "My aunt," she whispered, her eyes automatically turning to Cordelia, who had gone deathly pale. "Did she never tell you?" the leader continued, clearly savoring the shock his revelation had caused. "Dear Cordelia isn't just some benevolent village woman who took pity on an orphaned child. She is Liralei's younger sister, Princess Cordelia of the Fallen Realm, the woman who was supposed to die alongside the rest of the royal family 25 years ago." The Queensbane dagger trembled in Cordelia's grip as she faced the moment she had dreaded for 2 decades. Around her, she could feel the weight of stares from Magnus, the village elders, Damon, and most devastatingly, from Mira herself. "Is it true?" Mira's voice was barely audible, but it carried across the sudden silence with devastating clarity. Cordelia's shoulders sagged as the final secret, the one she had sworn to carry to her grave, was torn from her by forces beyond her control. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "I am your aunt, not your stepmother. Liralei was my sister, and you are my brother's child by blood as well as by love." "But that would make you," Magnus began, his historian's mind working through the implications. "The second heir to the throne," Damon finished, his storm-grey eyes fixed on Cordelia with newfound understanding. "Which explains how you've been able to maintain such powerful ward stones for 20 years. You're not just magically gifted, you carry royal blood yourself." The enemy leader clapped slowly, the sound echoing across the garden with mocking applause. "Very good, Vampire Lord. Yes, Princess Cordelia has been quite the actress all these years, playing the humble village woman while sitting on enough power to rival her own niece. Mira felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet once again. Everything she had believed about her life, about the woman who had raised her, about her own place in the world, it was all built on layers of deception that ran deeper than she had ever imagined. Why? "Is no tension?" she asked, and the single word carried 20 years of confusion, hurt, and betrayal. "Why lie to me about this? About everything?" Cordelia dropped the dagger and moved toward her niece with desperate urgency. "Because I watched my sister die for her crown. Because I saw what happened to everyone who knew the truth about the royal bloodline. Because I would rather spend eternity as a nameless village woman than see you suffer the same fate that claimed the rest of our family." "Our family," Mira repeated numbly. "How much of our family? How many people died that I never knew existed?" It was the enemy leader who answered, his voice carrying the cruel precision of a blade finding its target. "Your grandfather, the king. Your grandmother, the queen. Your uncle, Prince Marcus, and his 3 children. Your aunt, Princess Isabella, and her twin daughters. Shall I continue? The royal massacre was quite thorough." "Stop!" Damon commanded, his voice carrying supernatural authority that made even the enemy leader pause. "You've made your point." But the damage was already done. Mira swayed on her feet as the full scope of the tragedy that had shaped her life crashed over her. An entire family, an entire royal line, destroyed while she lived in safety, ignorant of what had been lost to protect her. Cordelia reached for her, but Mira stepped back, her green eyes blazing with emotions too complex to name. "You let me believe I was alone. You let me think I was nothing special, that I was weak and sickly and needed protection. But I'm not just the daughter of a queen, I'm part of a dynasty that was murdered while I hid in a cellar." "You were a child," Cordelia said desperately. "You needed to be protected. I needed to know who I was." Mira's power flared with her emotional turmoil, sending waves of energy that made every supernatural being present take a step backward. "I needed to understand why my dreams were full of crowns and castles and women who looked like me. I needed to know that somewhere in the world there were people who shared my blood." The enemy leader seized on her distress with predatory precision. "And that's exactly why you need proper guidance, child. The emotional storms of untrained royal power have destroyed kingdoms before. With us, you would learn control, discipline. With you, she would learn slavery." Damon interrupted, moving to place himself between the enemy and Mira, despite her obvious anger at everyone present. "I've seen your methods of guidance before. They involve breaking the spirit to better control the power." It was then that Cordelia made the revelation that changed everything they thought they understood about the past 20 years. "The murder of the royal family wasn't random political upheaval," she said, her voice carrying across the garden with the weight of long-held truth. "It was orchestrated by the same forces that stand before us now. They didn't want to destroy the royal bloodline. They wanted to control it. My sister's escape, her exile, her supposed death, all of it was part of their plan to eventually reclaim her and her power." Magnus gasped as the implications hit him. "You mean Elena Blackwood wasn't chosen by Lord Damon through natural soul bond recognition?" Cordelia continued, her confession gaining momentum as the final secrets tumbled free. She was presented to him by agents of these same enemies who had been tracking her since her escape from the kingdom. They wanted to see what would happen when royal blood mixed with vampire power. Damon's face had gone completely still, but there was murder in his eyes as he processed what Cordelia was telling them. "She was a plant. My mate, my supposedly destined mate, was sent to spy on me." "Not spy," Cordelia said quietly. "To bear a child whose mixed heritage could be molded into the perfect weapon, a being with royal magical power and vampire physical abilities, raised by those who would shape her into their ideal ruler." The enemy leader's composure cracked for the first time, rage replacing his cool amusement. "Enough. "You've said quite enough, Princess." But Cordelia wasn't finished. Reaching beneath her skirts, she pulled out an object that made everyone present freeze in recognition. The binding crown queen, Liralei's lost crown of silver thorns, the artifact that had supposedly been destroyed with the rest of the royal regalia. "This is why Elena really died," she said, holding the crown so its silver surface caught the fading light. "Not because of illness, and not because Damon killed her. She died because she refused to let our enemies use her child as a weapon. She died protecting the one thing that could give them absolute control over vampire bloodlines, the crown that grants dominion over all supernatural beings who have sworn fealty to the royal house." Mira stared at the crown, feeling its power call to her across the space that separated them. It was beautiful and terrible, wrought in silver that seemed to move with its own inner life. The thorns that formed its circlet were sharp enough to draw blood, and she understood instinctively that such blood would be required to activate its full power. "That crown," the enemy leader said, his voice tight with controlled fury, "belongs to us. We are the rightful guardians of royal power." "The crown belongs to the rightful heir," Cordelia replied, her eyes fixed on Mira, "and the rightful heir chooses her own destiny." For a moment that stretched into eternity, Mira stood at the crossroads of choice. She could take the crown and claim her birthright, accepting all the power and responsibility that came with it. She could refuse it and continue living as she had, hidden from a destiny too large and dangerous to embrace. Or she could find a third path, one that honored her heritage without surrendering her freedom. When she finally moved, it was toward Damon rather than toward Cordelia and the crown. She took his hand, feeling the instant connection that flowed between them, and turned to face their enemies with new resolve. "I am Mira, daughter of Queen Liralee and heir to the royal bloodline," she declared, her voice carrying across the mountainside with absolute authority. "But I am also my own woman, bound by choice to my own mate, and I will not be used as a weapon by anyone, including my own family." The crown pulsed with light as she spoke, responding to the power in her voice, even from a distance. But it remained in Cordelia's hands, waiting for a decision that would reshape the supernatural world. The revelation of the binding crown's presence had shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. What had begun as a battle for Mira's freedom had become something far more complex, a struggle for control of supernatural power that could reshape the balance between vampire and human worlds. The enemy leader's composure had cracked completely, revealing the desperation beneath his calculated facade. "You understand nothing," he snarled, his form beginning to blur and shift as his true nature manifested. "That crown has been lost for 25 years. Kingdoms have fallen searching for it. Wars have been fought over rumors of its location, and you've been hiding it in a cottage root cellar like some common trinket." Cordelia's grip on the binding crown tightened, and Mira could see the way her aunt's hands trembled not with fear, but with the effort of containing the crown's power. The silver thorns were beginning to glow with their own inner light, responding to the presence of so much supernatural energy in one location. "I've been protecting it," Cordelia replied with dignity that spoke to her royal breeding. "Just as I've been protecting the last heir to the throne that crown represents. Neither my niece nor this artifact will be used as weapons in your quest for dominion." Damon stepped closer to Mira, his predatory instincts fully awakened by the escalating threat. During the revelations and confrontations, he had been observing their enemies with tactical precision, cataloging their numbers, their formations, and most importantly, their weaknesses. What he had discovered was both reassuring and terrifying. "They're not just after the crown," he murmured to Mira, his voice too low for their enemies to overhear. "Look at how they're positioned. They've surrounded not just the cottage, but the entire village. This isn't a targeted extraction, it's a full-scale occupation." Mira followed his gaze and felt her heart sink. Through the trees surrounding the cottage, more figures were visible now that her awakened senses allowed her to perceive them clearly. Dozens of supernatural beings had taken positions throughout Ravenshollow, effectively cutting off any escape routes and ensuring that no one could leave to summon help. "The villagers," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. "They're using the entire population as leverage." "Precisely," the enemy leader confirmed, having overheard her despite Damon's precautions. "Every man, woman and child in Ravenshollow is now under our protection. Their safety depends entirely on your cooperation, Your Highness." The title was spoken with mocking emphasis, but Mira felt the weight of responsibility it carried settling on her shoulders like a mantle of lead. These people, innocent families who had lived peacefully under Damon's protection for generations, were now hostages because of her awakening. Magnus, who had been silent during the family revelations, stepped forward with more courage than his aged frame should have been able to muster. "You cannot hold an entire village responsible for the actions of individuals. The ancient laws, the ancient laws," the enemy leader interrupted with cold amusement, "are written by those with the power to enforce them, and at this moment we hold that power." It was then that Damon made a decision that surprised everyone present, including Mira herself. Instead of preparing for battle or attempting negotiation, he began to remove the ceremonial coat he wore, revealing the network of silver scars that covered his torso like a map of past conflicts. "What are you doing?" Mira asked, alarmed by his sudden vulnerability. "Preparing for the Covenant ritual," he replied calmly, though his eyes remained fixed on their enemies with unwavering intensity. "If they want to claim authority over our union, let them face the full consequences of that challenge." From his coat's inner pocket, he withdrew the Covenant blade, a ceremonial sword that Mira had only glimpsed in her dreams. The weapon was beautiful and terrible, its blade forged from metals that existed only in the deepest places of the earth and tempered with the blood of the first vampire lords. Runes along its edge pulsed with power that made the very air around it shimmer. "The Covenant ritual hasn't been performed in over 2 centuries, Magnus whispered, his historian's knowledge providing context for what he was witnessing. "My lord, the risks are acceptable," Damon finished, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had ruled for centuries. "If we are to face this threat, it will be as true mates, bound by blood and covenant, rather than mere attraction." Cordelia understood the implications immediately. "The ritual will make you equals in power. It will bind your life forces together permanently. If one of you dies, then both die," Mira finished, her newly awakened memories providing knowledge she hadn't consciously possessed moments before. "But it will also make us stronger than either could be alone, strong enough to face whatever they can throw at us." The enemy leader laughed, but there was genuine unease in the sound. "Now, you would risk everything on an ancient ritual that could kill you both. How romantically foolish." "Not foolish," Mira said, stepping forward to accept the Covenant blade from Damon's hands. The moment her fingers closed around its hilt, she felt power surge through her that was both familiar and entirely new. "Necessary. You want to control me because you believe I'm too young and inexperienced to wield royal power responsibly, but you've made one crucial error. And what would that be? You've assumed that I'm alone." Mira's eyes found Damon's, and the connection that sparked between them was visible to everyone present. A queen without a kingdom may be vulnerable, but a queen with a true partner, someone who shares her power and her purpose, that's something far more dangerous than you've prepared to face. Around them, the supernatural tension was building to a crescendo that made the very ground beneath their feet tremble. The cottage's protective wards, already weakened by Mira's earlier awakening, began to fail completely under the pressure of so much concentrated power. Ancient stones cracked, releasing centuries of stored protective magic into the air in dazzling displays of light and energy. But it was Cordelia who provided the element that none of them had anticipated. As the enemy forces began to close in, clearly intending to disrupt the ritual before it could begin, she made the ultimate sacrifice that her royal blood demanded. "I invoke the right of royal substitution," she declared, her voice carrying across the mountainside with authority that made every supernatural being present freeze in place. It was an ancient law, one that predated the current conflicts by centuries, and its invocation carried consequences that could not be ignored. "Aunt, no," Mira gasped, understanding immediately what Cordelia intended. The rite allows a member of the royal bloodline to temporarily assume the full power and responsibility of the crown in times of extreme crisis, Cordelia continued, already moving toward the binding crown despite Mira's protests. "But the cost is your life," Damon finished grimly. "Cordelia, you cannot." "I can and I will," she replied with finality. "Mira needs time to complete the covenant ritual safely. The village needs protection from these invaders. And I," her voice softened as she looked at her niece with infinite love and pride, "I need to finally do what I should have done 25 years ago when they murdered my family." The binding crown settled onto Cordelia's head, as if it had been waiting for this moment for decades. The silver thorns drew blood as they made contact with her skin, and that blood activated power that had lain dormant since Queen Liralei's death. Light erupted from Cordelia's form, transforming her from a simple village woman into the royal princess she had always been. But the transformation came at a terrible price. Mira could see her aunt aging years with every second that passed, the crown's power burning through her life force with devastating intensity. The right of royal substitution would give her perhaps 10 minutes of absolute authority, 10 minutes to protect her niece and the village she had called home for 2 decades. "Use this time wisely," Cordelia commanded, her voice now carrying the full weight of royal authority. "Complete your ritual, claim your power, and show these fools what happens when they threaten the people you love." Around them, the enemy forces found themselves unable to advance, held in place by the absolute command of activated royal blood. Their leader struggled against the compulsion, his own considerable power barely able to resist the crown's dominion over supernatural beings. Mira felt tears streaming down her face as she understood what her aunt was sacrificing for her. But there was no time for grief, not when Cordelia's sacrifice was giving them the opportunity they needed to change the balance of power permanently. "Together," she said to Damon, raising the covenant blade between them. "Together," he agreed, placing his hand over hers on the weapon's hilt. The ritual that followed would be spoken of in supernatural circles for centuries to come. As their blood mingled on the ancient blade, power flowed between them that was greater than the sum of its parts. Mira felt her royal magic expanding and deepening as it connected with Damon's vampire strength and immortality. In return, her power tempered his predatory nature with wisdom and compassion that had been passed down through generations of royal blood. When the ritual was complete, they faced their enemies not as individuals fighting separate battles, but as a unified force that represented something entirely new in the supernatural world. The true test of that unity was about to begin. The moment the covenant ritual reached completion, reality itself seemed to shift around Mira and Damon. The air between them shimmered with visible threads of connection that spoke of power, shared, and destinies intertwined beyond any possibility of separation. When they opened their eyes and looked at each other, what they saw was perfection, 2 halves of a whole that had finally found their missing piece. But there was no time to savor their transformation. Around them, the enemy forces were already adapting to Cordelia's temporary dominion, their leader's considerable power, allowing him to partially overcome the royal compulsion that held his followers frozen. "Impressive," he snarled, his form wavering between human appearance and something far more monstrous. "But substituted authority burns bright and dies quickly. When your aunt falls, you'll face us with only your untested bond to protect you." He was right, and they all knew it. Already, Cordelia's borrowed time was running out. The silver crown's thorns had drawn deep channels of blood down her temples, and her royal bearing was being consumed by the effort of maintaining absolute control over dozens of supernatural beings simultaneously. She had minutes at most before the strain killed her. "Then we'd better make those minutes count," Mira replied, stepping forward with Damon at her side. The heartstone amulet that he had given her during the ritual now pulsed against her chest, amplifying the connection between them until she could feel his thoughts as clearly as her own. Together, they raised their hands, and what happened next defied every conventional understanding of supernatural warfare. Mira's royal power, now enhanced and stabilized by her bond with Damon, reached out to every living thing within miles. Not just the supernatural beings who threatened them, but the very mountain itself responded to her call. Trees that had stood for centuries bent their branches into weapons and barriers. Stone paths cracked and reformed into defensive walls. Even the perpetual mist that cloaked Ravenshollow became an ally, thickening into an impenetrable fog that confused and disoriented their enemies. But it was Damon's contribution that turned their defense into something truly formidable. His vampire nature, tempered by Mira's compassion but enhanced by her power, allowed him to move through the battlefield like a force of nature. He was no longer simply fast or strong, he had become something approaching elemental, a being of shadow and silver who struck with precision that seemed to anticipate his enemies' movements before they made them. The first phase of the battle was a revelation to everyone present, including Mira and Damon themselves. Their enemies had come prepared to face either an untrained royal heir or an isolated vampire lord. They had not prepared to face a unified force that combined the best aspects of both while eliminating the weaknesses that had made each vulnerable when alone. 3 of the enemy's elite fighters converged on Damon simultaneously, there, in supernatural speed, creating a blur of motion that should have overwhelmed even his enhanced reflexes. Instead, he seemed to dance between their attacks with an almost casual grace, guided by Mira's ability to sense hostile intent before it became action. When he struck back, it was with precision that ended each threat permanently. Meanwhile, Mira faced the challenge of protecting not just herself and her allies, but the entire village that had become collateral in this supernatural war. Her power, now amplified beyond anything the old royal bloodline had achieved, reached into every cottage and protected dwelling in Ravenshollow. She wrapped each building in barriers of living wood and stone that would hold against supernatural assault, while still allowing the villagers inside to breathe and move freely. Magnus, cowering behind the cottage walls with the other village elders, watched in awe as his quiet mountain community was transformed into a fortress that rivaled anything from the old legends. "Is this what true royal power looks like?" he whispered to his companions. "This is what royal power looks like when it's wielded by someone who chooses love over dominion," Cordelia replied, though her voice was growing weaker as the crown's demands continued to drain her life force. "This is what I hoped she would become." The enemy leader, recognizing that his carefully planned assault was failing, made a decision that revealed the true depths of his desperation. Instead of continuing to attack Mira and Damon directly, he began targeting the village itself, not the buildings, which were protected by Mira's power, but the people inside them. Dark tendrils of energy shot toward the cottage windows, where frightened faces peered out at the supernatural battle raging in their streets. The attack was designed not to kill, but to drain, to steal the life force from innocent villagers and use it to fuel his own flagging power. It was exactly the kind of cruelty that Mira's newly awakened queenly nature could not tolerate. "No," she said, and the word carried such absolute authority that reality itself seemed to bend around it. The dark tendrils struck an invisible barrier and shattered like glass against stone. But more than that, the enemy leader suddenly found himself facing the full weight of royal judgment, backed by vampire enforcement. When Mira looked at him now, her eyes blazed with silver fire that spoke of power inherited through generations of queens who had protected their people against exactly this kind of threat. "You have threatened innocence under my protection," she declared, her voice echoing across the mountainside with supernatural resonance. "That is a crime that demands immediate response." For the first time since the confrontation began, genuine fear flickered across the enemy leader's face. He was beginning to understand that he hadn't just awakened a powerful royal heir, he had triggered the emergence of something far more dangerous. A true queen bound in partnership with a vampire lord who shared her purpose, protecting a people who had become truly theirs to defend. The enemy leader's fear transformed into something far more dangerous, desperate fury. When beings of his power felt cornered, they became capable of acts that defied both reason and self-preservation. As Mira and Damon advanced on him with the unified force of their completed bond, he made a choice that would haunt the survivors of this battle for decades to come. "If I cannot have the crown and the girl," he snarled, dark energy coalescing around his form until he appeared more shadow than substance, "then no one shall have them." The spell he began to weave was ancient and forbidden, one that would drain the life force from every living thing within a 20-mile radius to fuel a single devastating attack. Trees began to wither at their roots. The very grass beneath their feet turned brown and cracked. Even the stones of the cottage began to age and crumble as centuries of accumulated time caught up with them in moments. But he had made a crucial error in his calculations. The unity chalice that hung at Damon's side, the same vessel that had detected Mira's awakening, began to glow with brilliant silver light as it responded to the life-draining magic. The chalice had been forged specifically to protect the soul bond between vampire and royal bloodline, and it would not allow that bond to be severed by external force. "Mira," Damon said urgently, understanding immediately what needed to be done. "The chalice, it can reverse his spell, but we have to complete the circle." Without hesitation, Mira stepped forward and placed her hands on the sacred vessel alongside his. The moment their skin made contact with the ancient silver, power flowed between them that was greater than anything they had experienced during the ritual. The chalice became a conduit for their combined will, amplifying their shared purpose until it could touch every corner of the supernatural battlefield. What happened next would be remembered as the moment when the old ways of power dominion through fear and control gave way to something entirely new. Instead of fighting the enemy's life-draining spell directly, Mira and Damon transformed it. Where the dark magic sought to steal and destroy, they channeled life and renewal. The withering trees burst into new growth that reached toward the sky with impossible speed. The cracking stones healed themselves and grew stronger than they had ever been. Even the air itself seemed to shimmer with vitality that made everyone present feel more alive than they had in years. The enemy leader's spell, robbed of its destructive purpose, turned back on him with devastating effect. The power he had tried to steal returned to its sources, leaving him drained and vulnerable, while his intended victims grew stronger with each passing moment. But Cordelia, who had been maintaining her royal dominion over the other enemy forces throughout the battle, finally reached the limit of what the crown's power could demand from her mortal form. The silver thorns had carved channels so deep in her temples that her royal blood flowed freely down her face, and her breathing had become labored as her life force burned away like a candle flame in a hurricane. "Mira," she called weakly, her voice barely carrying across the garden. "The crown, you must take it before." She didn't finish the sentence. The binding crown slipped from her head as she collapsed, its silver surface now stained with the blood of two royal sisters who had given everything to protect what they loved. The moment Cordelia fell, the enemy forces found themselves free from royal compulsion, but instead of renewing their attack, they hesitated, clearly shaken by what they had witnessed. Their leader was defeated, their careful plans had crumbled, and they faced opponents whose power seemed to grow stronger with each challenge. It was Mira who ended the conflict, but not through violence. Moving to where Cordelia lay, She gently lifted the binding crown and placed it on her own head. The thorns drew her blood as they had her aunt's, but instead of draining her life force, they seemed to accept her as their rightful bearer. Power flowed through her that was both ancient and utterly new, the authority of the old royal bloodline, combined with the strength of her bond with Damon and the wisdom she had gained through love rather than conquest. When she turned to face the remaining enemies, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority, tempered by compassion that was foreign to those who sought to rule through fear. "This conflict ends now," she declared. "You came here seeking to control power that was never yours to command. Instead, you have witnessed what happens when that power chooses its own path. I offer you one chance to withdraw with your lives. Those who accept will never be pursued. Those who refuse will face the consequences of their choice." The enemy leader, drained and defeated, looked at her with something approaching respect. "And what of the old alliances, the political structures that have governed supernatural relations for centuries? Will adapt or be replaced by something better," Mira replied with finality. "The crown chooses partnership over dominion, protection over conquest. Those who can accept that change will find welcome in the new order. Those who cannot, she let the implication hang in the air." One by one, the enemy forces began to withdraw, melting back into the forest with the defeated resignation of those who knew when they had been outmaneuvered completely. Their leader was among the last to leave, but he paused at the garden's edge to offer what might have been either warning or prophecy. "This is not over, Your Majesty. There are others who will not accept change so easily. Then they will learn what my aunt learned," Mira replied sadly, kneeling beside Cordelia's still form, "that some prices are worth paying to protect what matters most." As the last of their enemies disappeared into the mountain darkness, the immediate crisis was over. But the work of building something new from the ashes of the old had only just begun. 3 months had passed since the night that changed everything in Ravenshollow. The cottage garden, once scarred by supernatural battle, had grown into something extraordinary under Mira's unconscious influence. Where Cordelia's blood had fallen, silver roses now bloomed, flowers that carried the essence of royal sacrifice and would serve as a memorial to the princess who had given everything to protect her people. Mira stood beside the largest of these roses, her fingers gently touching its petals as she spoke to the aunt, who could no longer answer. The binding crown had been transformed in the weeks following Cordelia's death, its silver thorns softening into a delicate circlet that drew no blood from its wearer. The change reflected Mira's own evolution from hidden girl to protective queen power that served rather than demanded. "The villagers are adapting well to the changes," she said softly, as if Cordelia could hear her. "Magnus has proven surprisingly capable as our liaison with the other mountain communities. He says word is spreading that Ravenshollow has become a place where supernatural and human concerns are balanced rather than one serving the other." Behind her, Damon emerged from the cottage carrying 2 steaming cups of tea, a domestic gesture that would have seemed impossible from the ancient vampire lord who had awakened 3 months ago. The covenant ritual had changed him as profoundly as it had changed Mira, tempering his predatory nature with her compassion, while strengthening her royal authority with his accumulated wisdom. "The delegation from the Eastern Kingdoms arrived this morning," he said, offering her one of the cups. "They're curious about our experimental approach to supernatural governance." Mira accepted the tea with a smile that carried both warmth and weariness. The past months had brought a steady stream of visitors to their remote village, some seeking alliance, others testing their resolve, still others simply trying to understand how a 20-year-old woman and a centuries-old vampire had managed to create something entirely new in the supernatural world. The new covenant stone, formed from the crystallized power released during their climactic battle, had become the physical symbol of their unconventional rule. The crystal formation grew larger each day, fed by the harmony between the human and supernatural residents of Ravenshollow. Its presence had begun to influence the very nature of the mountain itself, creating a zone where old enmities lost their power and cooperation became not just possible, but natural. "How many does this make?" Mira asked, settling beside Damon on the stone bench they had carved together in Cordelia's honor. 17 delegations in 3 months, he replied with gentle amusement. And each one leaves with the same confused understanding that we cannot be conquered, controlled, or convinced to expand our influence through traditional means. It was true. The attempts to draw them into existing political structures had been constant and creative. Offers of alliance came from vampire lords seeking to strengthen their positions. Human kingdoms proposed marriages that would secure their borders. Even supernatural councils had extended invitations to join their governing bodies. All had been politely declined. "We have what we need here," Mira had told each delegation. "A people who trust us to protect them, a purpose that grows from love rather than ambition, and a power that serves rather than commands. Why would we trade that for something lesser?" The question had no answer that satisfied those who viewed power as something to be accumulated rather than shared. But for the residents of Ravenshollow, the answer was evident in their daily lives. Children who had once feared the darkness now played in gardens that bloomed year-round. Elderly villagers found their ailments eased by proximity to the new Covenant stone. Even the weather seemed gentler, as if the mountain itself had decided to shelter those under Mira and Damon's protection. Magnus approached them across the garden, his step lighter than it had been in years. The village elder had embraced his role as bridge between old traditions and new possibilities, with enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including himself. "Your Majesty, Lord Damon," he said, the titles now carrying affection rather than formal distance. "The Evening Council is prepared to receive your guidance on the Harvest Festival preparations." The Harvest Festival had been Mira's innovation, a celebration that honored both human agricultural traditions and vampire cultural customs. The blending of practices that had once been kept strictly separate had created something beautiful and entirely unique. "We'll be there shortly," Mira replied, then paused thoughtfully. "Magnus, has there been any word from the scouts about the settlements to the west?" "Peaceful contact established with 3 communities," he reported with satisfaction. "All express interest in learning more about our approach to shared governance. None have made formal requests for protection or alliance, but the seeds of curiosity have been planted." It was exactly what Mira had hoped, for organic growth of their influence through example rather than conquest. The changes they had implemented in Ravenshollow were beginning to inspire similar experiments elsewhere, creating a network of communities that chose cooperation over conflict. As Magnus departed to finalize the council preparations, Mira and Damon sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind. The mountain peaks that had become truly theirs. The perpetual mist that had once shrouded the village still swirled around its borders, but now it carried the warmth of protection rather than the chill of concealment. "Do you ever wonder what Cordelia would think of what we've built?" Mira asked, her fingers unconsciously touching the silver roses that marked her aunt's sacrifice. "I think she would be proud," Damon replied thoughtfully. "She spent 20 years protecting you from a destiny she feared would destroy you. Instead, you've transformed that destiny into something that heals rather than harms." "We transformed it," Mira corrected gently, turning to face the man who had become far more than her mate. In him, she had found not just love, but true partnership, someone who shared both her power and her responsibility for using it wisely. "Together," he agreed, as he had on the night they first joined their powers. "Always together." As darkness settled over Ravenshollow, the new Covenant stone began its nightly display, a soft luminescence that lit the village with gentle radiance. In that light, the future looked bright, with possibilities that honored the past, while building something entirely new. The last heir of the royal bloodline had found her throne not in conquest but in service. her crown not in dominion but in love, and her kingdom not in tradition but in the revolutionary idea that power existed to protect those who placed their trust in it. In the years to come, that idea would change the world, but tonight it was enough that it had changed one small mountain village and the two souls who had discovered that the greatest magic of all was the simple choice to care for others as much as they cared for themselves.